Now let us open our ears and our minds and our hearts to these words from the still speaking God. This story comes from the book of Genesis. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. And these are the descendants of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, that is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age. And he made him an ornamental robe. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. And suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then all your sheaves gathered round and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. And he had another dream, and he told this one to his brothers as well, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars were all bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers went out to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Jacob said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of the hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornamented robe that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. with their camels carrying gum and balm and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay down our hands on him, for he is our brother and our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. And when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph off to Egypt. ... To be continued. May God bless our hearing and understanding of these sacred words. Well, I guess it's time to talk about family dynamics. We all have family dynamics, I'm sure. I know my own family has its set of dynamics. I grew up as the youngest of 5 boys in my family. And I will admit that my older brothers were all very smart. And some of them were athletically talented. And so I had a lot to be compared to when I was growing up as the youngest. You know, I was the low person on the totem pole, and when my dad would call out for my name, it was often Ted, Jeff, John, Steve, Chris! As I went through school, you know, I was always known as so-and-so's little brother. Oh, you must be Steve's little brother. Well, one day I was fed up with hearing that, and my response to the teacher was, "No, he's my brother." Because I was the student who was before that teacher at that time, and I didn't want to be compared with my brother. Yeah, for me, and my wife, who is also the youngest in her family, we commiserate on how difficult it was to be the youngest in the family. So I'm guessing there are a few youngest members of the family out there. Yeah. And middle, and a couple oldest in the family, yeah. And when I talk to my brothers about this, they all complain that they were the ones who, each one had their tough times. My oldest brother thinks that I had it easy, because he had to bend all the rules that I got to enjoy the freedom of by the time it got to me. My middle brother complains that he was always, being compared to all of the other ones, So we all have our family dynamics to deal with. I remember I was always watching my older brothers go off and do stuff that I was told I was too young to do. And, I'll admit that my parents were probably right. I was too young to do some of the stuff that they were doing. Although they were probably too young to be doing it too. But that's another issue. When I think about my family dynamics and all the complaining I do about it, and I hear this story about Joseph and his 12 brothers, I had it easy. My brothers never, ever threw me in a pit or sold me into slavery. I'll give my brothers that, at least. So let's take a look at Joseph and his family. We often hear the story of Joseph and his many-colored dream coat. But this is a difficult story, really. Joseph was the youngest of a blended family. And Joseph's mother was Jacob's wife at the end of his life. And he was Jacob's favorite son. The other kids, the other brothers, were sons of Jacob's other wives. And they weren't Jacob's favorites. And Jacob showed his love for Joseph by giving him that beautiful, many-colored coat. So 2 things. I would say it's not surprising that Joseph had this puffed-up feeling about who he was and a sense of superiority over the rest of his brothers because, that's the kind of messages that his father was giving to him. And, it all came out in the subconscious of dreams. And so it's not surprising that his self-image of himself was that he would one day lord over the rest of his brothers. And whether or not they were actually prophetic, we shall see that when we hear the rest of the story in a few weeks. It's not surprising, really, that those other brothers would be resentful of all of this. I know my brothers were resentful of me when I ended up doing stuff that Mom and Dad said they could never do. And Joseph compounded their resentment by giving their dad bad reports of their performance out in the field. We all know that proverb, pride cometh before the fall. So we might say that Joseph had it coming. Not to say that, all that suffering that he was put through by his brothers was justified. But it is to say that the pride and his subsequent humiliation are key to what Joseph would become later in his life. And we'll learn about that as we hear the rest of the story in the weeks to come. So stay tuned. This is a way of getting you all to come back again. So at the time we leave the story, Joseph has been thrown into a pit, a waterless well. And, they've had this debate over whether they should kill him, which Reuben saves him from that fate. And then the brothers are given the opportunity to sell him off to the Ishmaelites who come through, and for a small price, it seems, some silver, etc., they sell him into slavery. I would say that Joseph's experience in the pit and his subsequent slavery and imprisonment, which we will learn about, are the key turning point in his life. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the book of Jonah. And we all remember Jonah as, being called by God to go off and preach repentance to the city of Nineveh. And I got to admit, if I were Jonah and offered the opportunity to go to a beach resort instead, I'd hop on the boat to the beach resort instead. But Jonah ends up being thrown overboard and swallowed up by a big fish. I can't think of anything more horrible than being in the belly of a big fish. And that's the turning point of Jonah's life, too. In the big book of AA and in other 12-step programs, true recovery begins only after one has hit bottom. come to that place where there's nowhere else but up. The big book of AA says, humility amounts to a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by an attempt to become what we could be. I'll say that again. Humility amounts to a clear recognition of what and who we really are, followed by an attempt to become what we could be. The good news is that, God is not the God of the pit in this story. God is not the God of the slavery or the imprisonment. If God was the God of the pit and the slavery, the story would end here. And that would be the end. But it doesn't. And God isn't the God of the pit. Rather, God is the God of the possibility born out of the pit, of what could be. Indeed, the entire universe is set up on what is possible, not on despair and hopelessness. We live in a universe of possibility. And we are evidence of that because the universe is a universe of the possibility of life, the possibility of each and every one of us, each and every one of you. God is not the God of the pit or of slavery or the belly of the fish. God is the God of possibility that comes after that moment of despair and deep humility. God is not the God of how things are, but how things might be. And so God calls to each one of us, into that realm of possibility. Out of wherever we find ourselves, where we feel that there's no way else but up, into the possibility of the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And as the big book of AA says, it's only by the humility of knowing just what and who we are can we make the attempt to become what God so wants us to be. With God, all things are possible. And as the song at the beginning of our worship this morning said to us, all we need is love. Amen.